the show can go on.
Each year, the worldwide Jewish community observes Yom Hashoa, Holocaust Remembrance Day, as the Jewish Federation of Fort Wayne does tonight. On behalf of the Federation, thanks to Rabbi Katapan, President Hohenheffer, and the Board of Congregation Achut V'Shalom for allowing us to hold our service here. Thanks also to the Dr. Harry W. Salem Foundation for underwriting the program. And especially thanks to all of you for coming and joining in this observance with us. We thank members of Fort Wayne clergy and representatives of congregations who are participating in the service tonight. The Reverend Dr. John P. Gardner, Plymouth Congregational Church of Fort Wayne. The Reverend Roger Reese, Executive Pastor, Associated Churches of Fort Wayne and Allen County. Mark Schneider, President of Congregation B'nai Jacob. The Reverend Misty Dawn Shelley, Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Fort Wayne. President Farrell M. Sorensen II, State President, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the Reverend Terry Anderson of Just Neighbors Interfaith Homeless Network. We must remember, this is the motto we repeat whenever we talk about the Holocaust. We believe we must keep these memories alive so that, perhaps, we can prevent history from repeating itself. Events around the world today, imaginable just a few years ago, underline this urgency. We must remember the victims, about 6 million Jews, as well as millions of innocents from other religious and ethnic groups who were slaughtered by the Nazis after enduring incredible cruelty. We must also remember those who were able to flee the Holocaust, who escaped what would have been their fate, but often at terrible personal cost. They had to leave their homes to make new lives in a different part of the world. Many of them never again saw their families. We are fortunate to have as our guest tonight someone who was able to flee with his parents, but who lost many of his family members as well. Later, he will share with us his vivid memories of how life changed after the Nazis took over his country. We must remember the rescuers, without whom many would not have survived the horrors of the Holocaust. These heroes risked their own lives and those of their families to save their Jewish neighbors. We remember those who suffered terrible atrocities in the Nazi camps, yet, against all odds, lived. Many of them were reluctant or even unable to tell their stories at first, but as time passed, more and more was revealed about the horrors these survivors had endured. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the camps and the end of the war. 7 decades have passed, and fewer survivors remain to talk about their experiences. So it becomes incumbent upon all of us to tell their stories, and especially to remember them all, victims and survivors alike. In this regard, we especially appreciate the dedicated teachers who teach about the Holocaust and help keep the memories alive. Teachers like Jeff Roberts of Wayne New Tech High School, whose students have been an integral part of this Yom Hashoa observance. And again, thank you all for joining us for this commemoration.
Good evening. My name is Robert Nance, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce City of Fort Wayne Mayor Tom Henry. No greater truism can be said of our mayor. Fort Wayne is in his blood. A native and lifelong resident of Fort Wayne, Mayor Henry was preceded by some 6 generations who called this region their home. One can also say our mayor has a deeply rooted sense of community, no doubt in part to the fact that he grew up in a household, one of 17 children. Such defining experiences have forged a mayor clearly dedicated to this community, serving for 20 years as a member of City Council and now in his 8th year as our mayor. His love of community and care for Fort Wayne is further demonstrated by his commitment to the value of every citizen, working to make sure that the city government represents everyone in our community and is accessible to all. His consistent commitment to this commemoration is just another example of his community mindfulness, and on behalf of everyone involved in this day of remembrance of Yom Hashoa, I offer heartfelt thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mayor Tom Henry.
Good evening. Thank you once again for inviting me to share this evening with you. And once again, I bring to you a proclamation from the city of Fort Wayne, which I know I've said to you many times before, but I think it's worth repeating that this proclamation, as well as a number of others, are put into a special database at Citizen Square because we want everyone in the future to remember certain events that happened in our city on certain days, because they reflect an organization's commitment to making our city a little bit better place to live. And with that, whereas from 1933 to 1945, 6 million Jews were systematically murdered by Nazi Germany and its collaborators. And whereas hundreds of thousands of Roma and a million more Slavs, persons with disabilities, religious and political dissidents, homosexuals, and others deemed by the Nazis as unworthy of life, were swept into the abyss. And whereas 2015 marks the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the camps and the defeat of Nazi Germany. And whereas all of our citizens should remember the atrocities committed by Nazi Germany and its collaborators and recognize that each of us must remain eternally vigilant against all tyranny. So is therefore that I, Thomas Henry, Mayor of the City of Fort Wayne, do hereby proclaim April 20th, 2015 as remembrance of the victims of the Holocaust Day in the City of Fort Wayne. And I salute the Fort Wayne Jewish Federation for making it possible for our community to gather in memory of those victims and for its continuing efforts toward overcoming prejudice and inhumanity through education. Thank you.
Friends, as we work through our litany this evening, we will have two responses for all. The first is Niskur, we will remember, then we will shift to Anuadine, we will bear witness. If you would work with us. Tonight we remember what happens when hate takes hold of the human heart, turns it to stone.
Niskur, we will remember.
We recall what happens when victims cry out for help, and there is no one listening.
We recall what happens when people are condemned because they are different, because a world that has no space for difference has no space for humanity.
We recall and pay tribute to the survivors who bore witness to what happened.
We recall without hate or desire for revenge, but simply to remember the victims, so that robbed of their lives, they would not be robbed also of their deaths.
We recall that their suffering should teach us that the road that begins with hate ends, if unopposed, at the gates of hell.
We recall and give thanks for the righteous of the nations who saved lives, often at the risk of their own, teaching us how in the darkness of night we can be the light, we can light a candle of hope.
We recall that in the Warsaw Ghetto, Jews added an 11th commandment, thou shalt not despair.
We believe that justice and peace will reign. God's splendor will then be seen in all humanity.
We believe in the sun, even when it is not shining. We believe in God, even when God is silent.
Ruthlessness and arrogance will cease to be. The glory of humanity will be revealed.
We believe that justice and peace will reign. God's splendor will then be seen in all humanity.
There will be peace within our walls, serenity within our homes. Hope in the Lord and be strong. Take courage and hope in the Lord.
I invite you to continue silently reading the candle reading poem. We now kindle these lights in memory of the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators. May the memory of the righteous be for a blessing. Zichronam livracha. continue now with prayer for the souls of the departed El Maleh Rachamim.
El Maleh Rachamim, Shochen Meromim, Ametsem Nuchan Chonat Achor, Kanfer Shechinah, Lemalot Kedoshim Uteorim, Chezor Arakim Azirim, Et Nishemot, 6 מיליון, Acheinu ve'achyoteinu, שנהרגו על קידוש השם, בעל הרחמים, יסתירם בסתר כנפת לעולמים, לצרור החיים את נשמתם, אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוח בשלום על משכבם, ונאמר Amen.
Fully compassionate God on high, to our 6 million brothers and sisters murdered because they were Jews, grant clear and certain rest with you in the lofty heights of the sacred and pure, whose brightness shines like the very glow of heaven. Source of mercy, forever enfold them in the embrace of your wings, secure their souls in eternity. Adonai, you are yours. They are yours. They will rest in peace. And together we say, Amen. I'd like to invite Dr. Ron Friedman, representing Rabbi Kornspan from Congregation B'nai Jake.
Please remain standing. On the next page, you'll find the Mourner's Kaddish, which we say in loving memory of those who have departed. We'll read it together in the Aramaic. The transliteration appears on the next page as well. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei Rabbah, v'yalmad divrah hirutei v'yamlich machutei, v'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei b'chol Beit Yisrael, Agalah v'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevorach v'yolam ulomeh umayah. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpahar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalach shmei v'kudishah b'richu. Le'ela min kol berchata v'shirata. Tushbechata v'nechemata. Da'miran v'yoma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya. V'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mirma. U'yaseh shalom. Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. You may be seated.
This concludes the service part of our evenings. I will invite our pulpit guests to sit with the congregation at this moment, and would like to invite Jackie Schreier to introduce the keynote speaker. We also have a little housekeeping to do up here, so please don't stand up. And maybe you want to stand up to stretch, but don't go away.
May I ask Josh from NewTech to come on up and help out? Thank you. On behalf of the Jewish Federation of Fort Wayne, Yom Hashoa Committee, thank you all for being here to remember the victims of the Holocaust and commemorate the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the camps. I am delighted to introduce Dr. Peter Braunfeld. Before I do, I would like to thank his wife Judy, his son Ken, for making the arduous journey to be with him this evening. So thank you, Judy and Ken. At the conclusion of Dr. Braunfeld's talk, we will allow time for a few questions. We welcome you to stay around a while for light refreshments at the back of the room. We are always grateful for delicious baked goods, and these are provided by Jan Sarator and her committee. While you are there, you absolutely must visit the art display and the social hall. The amazing paintings, drawings, and photographs were done by students in Mr. Jeff Roberts' classes at Wayne New Tech High School. The students have included an abstract to go with this artwork, and it will absolutely amaze you. I have many people to thank for putting this evening together. First, I'd like to thank the staff of Congregation Achdut Shalom. They are simply phenomenal. I want to thank the staff of the Jewish Federation of Fort Wayne for putting together all the materials you have been given, and also for the multitudes of other items I am constantly asking from them. I would like to thank Rabbi Katapan, David Reziks, and Sulan Kip for the inspiring music. And I would like to thank Rabbi Katapan and Rabbi Kornspan for the lovely and meaningful service. As always, we appreciate Mayor Tom Henry for his commitment to the city of Fort Wayne and for taking the time every year since he's been mayor to share in this commemoration ceremony. The stickers and the handouts you received upon entering the sanctuary were graciously distributed by the students in Mr. Roberts' social studies class. They will be handing you a candle as you leave, which we ask you to set in a window and light when you get home. Many of these students contributed to the art contest and the storyboards that are on display. I cannot express how impressed the Yom Hashoa Committee has been with these students and the faculty at Wayne New Tech High School. They are just astounding. I'd like to thank the Yom Hashoa Committee for their dedication to make Yom Hashoa a way to remember those victims of the Nazi Holocaust whose lives were taken from them. I invite you to join us at the Fort Wayne Museum of Art on Thursday, April 23rd for a meet and greet with renowned artist and sculptor Toby Kahn. Please refer to the handouts you received for additional information. On Monday, April 27th, Jenna Bloom, author of such books as Those Who Save Us, will be the featured speaker for the 2015 People of the Book event. Please plan to join us for what will definitely be an interesting lecture. At the end of Dr. Braunfeld's talk, we ask you to give us just a few more moments so that Mr. Roberts can explain a bit about the panels that are on display, starting in this room and going all the way back. Peter Braunfeld was born in Vienna, Austria in 1930 as the only child of Fritz and Johanna Braunfeld. His father was a successful lawyer, and his mother was a French teacher who enjoyed learning a multitude of languages. Until Peter was 8 years old, he led a rather charmed life, one that included skating and skiing in the winter outside of Vienna, while summering in the Austrian Alps and the Italian Riviera. This life changed very dramatically in the spring of 1938 when Adolf Hitler annexed Austria and it became part of the Nazi Third Reich. As a Jew, Peter's father lost his right to practice law, and many anti-Semitic laws were enacted designed solely to make the lives of Jews in Vienna miserable. The Braunfeld family decided to leave Vienna and move to Prague. Unfortunately, the Nazis soon occupied Prague, and his family was forced to flee again, this time to England. Upon arriving in Britain, World War II broke out. Like the citizens of England, Peter's family experienced the hardships of the German air raids on London. In 1940, they received permission to go to the United States. In September 1940, they set sail to cross the U-boat infested Atlantic Ocean. The Braunfeld family settled in Chicago, where Peter began his American schooling in the 4th grade. As immigrants, his parents struggled financially, but were happy to be in the United States. Through the family's affiliation with their synagogue, Peter learned quite a bit about Jewish history and Jewish religious beliefs and practices. As a serious student, Peter became eligible for a special program at the University of Chicago that allowed qualified high school students to start their college studies in their junior year of high school. He attended graduate school at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, finishing with a PhD in mathematics. Peter feels he was attracted to mathematics in part because of the certainty and the universality of its truths, much in contrast to his somewhat stormy and uncertain youth. Through his career as a math professor, Peter taught thousands of students the math they would need to become scientists, engineers, accountants, or simply well-educated individuals. He has received several awards for excellence in teaching, including the von Humboldt Prize from the government of Germany. So now it is my pleasure, and I would ask you all to welcome Dr. Peter Braunfeld.
I'd like to start by making sure that the microphone works, and to thank the people who made this trip of ours possible. I can't thank them all because I only know 3 names, and I wrote those down because I'm likely to forget them by the time I need them. I'd like to thank Jackie Schreier. I'd like to, of the Federation. I'd like to thank Fran Adler and Jan Serato for inviting me and going through all the trouble of making all this possible. And I'm really very excited to be here. I'm going to tell you the same thing I told the mayor earlier. This is my first trip to Fort Wayne, and I'm awed by what an attractive place it is. And I may decide to move here yet. It's really a very attractive town, and I'm very impressed. I'm glad that I got the introduction that I did because I don't have to say any of that because you already know it. And so I can spend a little bit more time on other things. As you can see from the picture that's on the screen, that is the main synagogue in the city of Vienna. There are many, many synagogues, just like in this country, of somewhat different persuasions and flavors of Judaism, but this is the main one. And as you can see, it's a very, very attractive and rather sumptuous building, actually. I might say something I didn't say. I spoke this afternoon, this morning rather, at the high school to a whole bunch of, probably a couple of hundred students who were responsible for these pictures and things. And I was also impressed by what thoughtful and sensitive people these students are. You're very lucky to have a youth like you do have. And the parents should be proud that they've raised them that way. Incidentally, this synagogue, despite the fact that it was very splendid, in fact survived the Nazis and was not destroyed as were most synagogues in Vienna during Kristallnacht, which is, as most of you know, the famous night when the Germans went berserk all over Germany, actually, And it was a sort of a nationwide pogrom in which many synagogues were burned. This one survived for a rather curious reason. It was built in, I think, about probably about 1810 or so. And it was, at that time, it was still forbidden in Austria to have houses of Jewish worship that could be recognized as such from the outside. And so this building, the outside of this building, shows no sign that inside there's a synagogue. And so I'm making this up, but the Nazis apparently forgot that it was there, so they didn't burn it down. By the way, how many of you have actually been to Vienna? You're lucky. As she said, I was born in Vienna. I had a golden childhood. My father was well-to-do. We did wonderful things. It's a wonderful city for children. They had children's art museum. They had children's plays at the theater. It was extremely, it was a really good place to grow up in, and I did indeed grow up there. Until everything changed when in 1938, when I was 7 years old. And the Nazis came and annexed Austria, and things became different. And I do remember, I lived, let's see, can I do this? Well, I'm technically in there. Help. Kenneth, you know how to work this? Why don't you go up there?
Is there a remote on?
This one? Okay. So I have this map at the very beginning to show you the route that we took from Vienna to Prague to London, to Bristol, and then up to Glasgow, and then the boat across to New York, and then to Chicago. And let's see. This is the Vienna City Hall. That's the place where the Viennese mayors had their offices. And it's a splendid building. And I want you to take note for a minute that there's a park. There's actually a park on either side of this main street that leads to the Rathaus. My apartment, the apartment that I grew up in, was right around the corner, maybe 30 years behind, 30 yards behind this tree. So we were very close. And I mention that because when Hitler marched into Austria, there was a huge parade, and this parade went up the street, and I could hear on the loudspeakers and on the radio the cheering mobs of people who cheered Hitler as he and his troops came in. I'll just mention, don't let anybody, very few people do this, but don't let anybody ever tell you that the Austrians were very upset that Hitler annexed Austria. They were ecstatic when that happened. There were huge crowds cheering the German troops coming in. And the next slide. This is the apartment building that I grew up in. As you may, those of you who've been to continental Europe know, the big cities in Europe, people didn't live in their own houses. They lived in big apartment buildings, and this was the one I lived in. You can see that it's a rather splendid building, and it was about 50 yards, as I said, from City Hall, and also from the courts. And my father did something very nice. He rented a double apartment. On each floor, there were 2 apartments. He rented a double apartment on this floor with the balcony, and he did that because he made one half of the floor into his living quarters, the family living quarters, and the other side was his office, which meant something very Viennese, that he didn't have to, he could, at noon he could come home have lunch and have a 2-hour nap, and then go right back to where he was working. So that was, so that's why this balcony, by the way, they can't see my finger. They can't see my finger. This balcony was a very important part of my life as a youngster, because as you can see, it's the only balcony on this fancy building. It was the balcony that I was put in on rainy days. It was protected from the rain, actually, so that I would get what is very important in the whole, I think, all the Jewish world, frische Luft, fresh air. And because it's very important to get fresh air, and I would spend my time on the balcony when I couldn't go to the park. And in fact, here you can see me. This is the balcony. Oops. You can see the balcony. I'm going to have to undo my habit of using my hands to touch it. And there's my mother playing with me, and here's my father making me feel adored. So all this is taking place on the balcony. And I move on. Yeah, I show this picture because I think it shows some important things. Here is Peter, I would guess somewhat at the age of 6 or 7 maybe, and here I am, and you'll notice that the trousers I'm wearing, you can't actually see the trousers, but you can see the top of it. Those are lederhosen, leather pants in English, which is to Austria and southern Germany what blue jeans are to the United States. It is the national costume. And it wasn't only worn by children, by the way. It was worn by adults and Jewish adults. So this was a sign the Jewish community expressing non-verbally its solidarity with the German-speaking Gentile world that they were living in. So it's kind of important. It's interesting to let you know that within a few weeks of the Nazis' arrival, one of the first edicts that came out was Jews were no longer allowed to wear leather pants. And especially Jewish children weren't allowed. Partly because leather pants also became the uniform of the Hitler Youth. And they didn't want anybody to have any thoughts that these Jewish kids were part of the Hitler Youth. You can imagine that for a kid who had grown up to think of leather pants as the symbol of his national identity, it was tough. And the question of why was this remained an unanswered question. In fact, I thought this picture, you'll probably recognize the man in the middle. And there you have your Hitler Youth people. Here's a boy, and you can see he's wearing exactly the same pants I was wearing. And there's the girl who's probably a Hitler maiden. And then in the back you can see there's an SS man. So you get sort of a composite picture of Nazis. Now this is the park I mentioned before, and that was the City Hall Park. And it's a very beautiful park. You can see it has fountains and things. Shortly after the prohibition of leather pants, the next edict that came out was the Jews were, and many of you probably know this, Jews were not allowed in parks. There were big signs put up in the parks, Juden verboten. And so that cut me off, actually, because there were no backyards. There was really no green space other than these public parks. It was very difficult. It was difficult for me to see my friends and to have the usual social life that kids at that time had. And here you can see, I said before, the Austrians certainly, by and large, not that they weren't anti-Nazi people. In fact, there were Austrians who left because of the Nazis. But you can see that there were lots of people who were pretty enthusiastic. And this is all the famous Hitler salute that you can see in that picture. Oops. Now here we get to the first scene of the kinds of things that happen to Jews. You can see, I hope, that you see people washing the streets, the sidewalks actually, with scrub brushes that had been given to them. These were Jews who were rounded up on the city streets and given mops and brooms and pails of water and told to scrub the streets in order to humiliate them. And you can see people watching this whole operation. That was the beginning of the kind of petty harassment that Jews were subjected to after the Nazi annexation of Austria. I have a personal anecdote to tell you about that. My mother's brother, my uncle, had married a Swiss woman who was from an immensely wealthy Swiss family. I'll just tell you, they were Swiss bankers, so you can imagine how well off they were. And when the Nazis came, they rounded her up in one of these roundups, and they handed her a brush and they said, wash the streets. And my Aunt Teresa, who was known for being an independent spirit, said to them, you know, I would be very happy to do that, but before I start, I think you ought to know that I'm a Swiss citizen. And at that time, the Nazis still cared about what people outside of Germany thought, because they they weren't as powerful and as arrogant as they later became. They were incredibly apologetic. They pointed out to her, they said, well, if that's the case, foreigners were given little flags of the country that they were citizens of, and they were supposed to wear those so that things like this wouldn't happen. And so she pulled out her handbag and she showed them the Swiss flag. They were very apologetic, and they immediately called a car and driver, presumably a Gestapo man who drove the car, and drove her to her apartment with profuse apologies as to this incident, and they hoped that they would forgive them. So that was a family story. Oops. Where is this?
The bottom right there.
The bottom. Oh, here it is. Well, before I get into the passport story, I'll tell you another story that's typical of that era of the Nazi reign. Like all good children of upper middle class parents, I needed orthodontia. I'm sure that many of you are acquainted with that. And I had started orthodontia about a year before the Anschluss, and I was going to a very famous orthodontist who was in the middle of this treatment with the brushes and the whole thing. By the way, I was thrilled because, I don't know if they still do this, at that time if you had orthodontia, you had these rubber bands, braces, and you were supposed to chew gum in order to and there was American gum, by the way, Wrigley. And the Europeans, the Austrians, took a very dim view of gum chewing. It was considered absolutely a no-no, but if you were doing it because you were having orthodontia, then it was okay. So that was good. At any rate, about, I'd say maybe 2, 3, so I was going regularly for these checkups to this famous orthodontist. And one day, I should have told you earlier, I had a nanny. Most Europeans of an upper middle class had nannies to take care of their children. In fact, I knew my nanny better than I knew my parents. And she was not Jewish. She was a Christian woman. She was a Catholic woman. And so my nanny took me to the orthodontist, and as we walked in the front door of his office, there was a big sign with a swastika on it, which said, you can guess what it said, we no longer accept Jewish patients. Now you might say, but it was a terrible thing for this orthodontist to do. He was obviously a Nazi. Not necessarily a Nazi. This man was also a professor of orthodontia at the University of Vienna. And if you were a professor, you were by definition a state employee. And if you were a state employee, you not only couldn't have Jewish patients, but you were supposed to join the Nazi Party. It's a big decision for someone to make, to give up his whole career because he didn't approve of what the Nazis were doing. And this was one of the people who was not one of the righteous in the Gentile. So we eventually got a Jewish orthodontist, and then and it was finished, and it looks pretty good. Here you have, I don't know, how many of you have seen a German passport of that era? Not too many of you. I thought it might interest you to see that. What's the first thing that strikes you on that passport? The red J, right? Red J. And you could, and red, God forbid people should miss it if it was in black. The red J was the famous J that later became the yellow star. And that was because you were supposed to carry your passport at all times, and if you were stopped and asked for your identity papers, you're supposed to show this passport. So they could tell without even asking whether you were Jewish or not. It became part of your identity. And there's some other things about it. This is my father's page, Dr. Fritz Braunfeld, and if you look carefully, you will see under here, it looks like it's crossed out, but it actually isn't, the word Israel. That was added later, and that was because it was also decreed that all Jewish men were to have the middle name Israel as part of their name. Again, they didn't even have to ask you, are you Jewish? They could tell, that if the J wasn't enough, they could tell by the fact that your middle name was Israel. And underneath it is my mother, Johanna, and her middle name that was put in later was Sarah, and all Jewish women had to take the name Sarah. Well, you might ask the question, how did that work? There are lots of people who aren't Jewish whose name is Sarah. A good example of it is Sarah Roosevelt, who was the mother, I guess, of President Roosevelt. Who, and by the way, the Nazis told the German people that proved that Roosevelt was Jewish. And by the way, Churchill also had a relative. Was it his wife's name? Sarah? I think it was his wife's name, Sarah. Well, the reason this worked in Germany and didn't work in other parts of the world is that in German, the name Sarah was almost unheard of for a Gentile to have. They tended not to take Old Testament names, and in fact they didn't, and so that was another giveaway. And here's my mother and father's passport pictures. You can see the stamp with the German eagle and the swastika underneath it. And so that's that. Okay, that's going. So anyway, that's later. Then it became increasingly difficult for Austrian Jews to keep their profession. And especially the legal profession. Jews were barred from being lawyers. Well, if that's your profession, it's kind of tough not to be a lawyer, although my father actually tried to start a little business. But it became increasingly clear that it was no place to be. Oh, and I should say this, that shortly after the Anschluss, my parents took me aside and said to me, you know, Peter, things have changed, and there are going to be new rules that you have to follow. And the rules are that you should do everything you can to be invisible. If you don't get into any quarrels with any Gentile child, don't have any kind of, never stand out, don't be noticeable, because if you had a quarrel with a Gentile child and he hit you and you hit him back, all he had to do was go home and say to his mother, that Jew hit me, and the mother could go to the warden, the the person who was in charge of that block, who was a Nazi, and who he could say, my child was abused by a Jew, and that would be enough to get you sent to Dachau. So that's the kind of anxiety that it was palpable in the air. So I was told, whatever it is that they want, whatever, don't ever take a toy away, just never be in the limelight. And so it was clear that there was no place to be. And so we left and we went to Prague. Now why Prague? Well, because Prague was one of the, Czechoslovakia at the time was one of the countries that quite recently had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so my father was actually born in what became Czechoslovakia. And so there were these three big cities, Budapest, Prague, and Vienna, that were all really kind of Austrian. And in fact, every Jewish family that I know of had relatives in all three of those places. And so Prague, there were people who were related to us, and they were friends of my father's, and they were clients of my father's. And so Prague was a very logical place to go. The only trouble with Prague was that in very short order, the Nazis annexed what's now the Czech Republic, and it became occupied by the Nazis. And so there they were again, and worse than before. The laws became stricter and stricter, and so then it became clear that Prague was no place to be either. And so then, I should have said earlier that my mother, well, my parents had already signed up at the American Embassy for emigrating to the for getting a quota number and emigrating to the United States. You had to register, and of course those quotas were way overcrowded, and it took years sometimes for your quota number to come up. And another thing that some people don't realize is that because so many people were trying to emigrate to the United States, in front of those embassies there were long lines of people who stood in line sometimes for days in order to get their number. And that was a time that the Gestapo would come by and would pick Jews at random and say, come with us, because they knew most of those people were Jewish, and so they had been collected for them. They didn't have to bother to going all over Vienna to pick them up. And so that was a very dangerous thing to do. And I have to say, speaking of righteous Gentiles, this nanny that I told you about, who was a Christian through and through, would stand in line for our family so that they could minimize the amount of time. Because if she was picked up, she could say, well, I'm interested in visiting an aunt in Milwaukee, you know, and she would not be taken to a concentration camp, obviously. So it became clear that it was time to leave there too, but as has been pointed out many times, very few places in the world were eager to accept penniless Jews to come into their country. You have to remember that 1939 was still the tail end of the Depression all over the world, and there were millions of people unemployed in Britain and in France and the United States, and so it was very, very difficult to get in. So the idea was, the United States idea was that you could come in only if you had a sponsor, and if that sponsor guaranteed that if you were unemployed, you will not go down to the local unemployment office and expect to get welfare checks. And so there was a frantic search that people had for finding sponsors. And I'll tell you how that worked a little bit, many different ways. One of the things my dad did was to go down to the Prague Public Library, to the New York, they had telephone directories in those days. And he went down to the New York Public Library, looked at the telephone directory for Braunfelds. And then he would write, Braunfeld is not a very common name, there may be 4 or 5 of them. And he would write to those Braunfelds and say, my name is Fritz Braunfeld, I'm a lawyer, I'm Jewish, my life is very difficult, I'm looking to come in. And I said, do you think you might be a relative? And if you are, maybe you can help us. And I actually have pictures with me of some of the letters that my father got in response. Usually the letters read, "I'm terribly sorry, I know it's very difficult for Jews in Austria, Germany these days, but there's really nothing I can do." And then it wasn't just Braunfeld, because, you know, my mother had a maiden name, and there were aunts and uncles who had other names, and so that was a standard thing of writing letters to seek support. I might say and I have some of those letters with me, I might say one of the things that surprised me when I looked at them again recently was, considering that my father had never lived in an English-speaking country, his English was very good. There were some mistakes, but it taught him a lot. So that's that. And so the next slide then deals with the fact that the next thing, that's in London. So we arrived in England without a penny in our pockets, and we had a sponsor in England, and that's a long story, and if you want to hear that, you have to pay another admission. And I'll tell you that story. Or you have to make a contribution to the Jewish fund or something. But we did get into England, because I should say this, we arrived in England on the 23rd of August, I believe it was. Yeah, I know. Now we're done. We're coming to the end. The 23rd of, very late in August. How many of you know when World War II broke out? In Europe? Nobody? September 1, 1939, the German panzers rolled into Poland. We left Germany in 1939, in August, I think it was the 23rd. So it was about 10 days. That's the difference between me talking to you here in Fort Wayne and a puff of smoke. Yeah. Because after September 1st, nobody got out, because the war was going on. And I say nobody, probably a trickle of people did get out. So this is, after the Germans conquered most of Europe, they started the air raids on London, which is where we were, and this is, I remember this because I was old enough. The sirens would go off, and you would take, in the middle of the night usually, and you would take your blanket and things, and you would go down to the subway station, and you'd spend the rest of the night in the subway station until the all clear came. Then you'd pack up your stuff, and you'd go back out. And that was sort of the way of life under the Blitz in London. The only thing I didn't mention is that in many cases, when you walk back out into the streets, the house you had left several hours earlier wasn't there anymore. And so that was not our problem because we didn't own a house. So that was England. Finally, the visa to come to America came through. I have pictures of that. If you want afterwards, I can show you some of that stuff. And so we had gotten a sponsor. We got the visa. We got the sponsor. We got the permission to enter the United States. We got the permission to leave England. I should have said earlier, by the way, in addition to get to England wasn't so easy either, because first the Brits had to let you in, and second the Germans had to let you out. And so I have the papers from the Gestapo, the permission to leave. And so then we left and came to the United States. And I say one more thing about that. This is the boat. It left from Glasgow. There were no more boats leaving from England proper, because that was so U-boat infested. The boats didn't come into the southern part of the ocean. They only came to the way up north. And that was the boat. It was later sank. And then, and this is the end of the story. Not really. This is unfortunately not completely and they lived happily ever after, because, and I don't usually have this as part of the talk, but I'll just finish with something a little bit more downbeat, namely that, so here you are in the United States and you're free to do whatever you like, except that you don't have a penny in your pocket, your English is not that great, you have no connections of people that would be interested in employing you. When my mother came to the United States, after 3 weeks, she was working on a power machine in a girdle factory. And this was from a woman who had been born with a silver spoon in her mouth. At any rate, I think I'll quit here and tell you that this has been said 1,000 times, it's been said here tonight, but it's basically the sermon part of my speech, is that the time to be careful is when these things start. If Hitler in 1933, you know, he was elected by popular vote, but if Hitler had said to the people of Germany in 1933, if you elect me, the first thing I'm going to do is round up all the Jews and send them to a camp, and I'm going to set up gas chambers and gas them, and then I'm going to take the corpses and burn them. There is no way in this world that he would have won that election. This is not something that, the way this happened is by little bits and pieces. Today this, tomorrow the other thing. So you got to stop this kind of thing at the beginning. And in fact, the Germans have a word for this. They call it salami tactics. Salami tactics is one little slice at a time. And I think that's a very important thing to remember. You can't wait till it gets so bad that you're horrified. Because by that time people are inured, they put up with it, lived with these things for a very long time, and every time another piece comes. So that's the advice I have for people, to not let this happen again, but to have to stop it very early in its tracks. I'd be happy, I don't know what the schedule is.
We have time for maybe 2 questions. And then Dr. Braunfeld will be here later, so I would encourage you to...
I'll answer questions privately, in private conversations. So if anybody has a question, I'd be happy to answer. And you have to speak up. Yes.
Yes, doctor. Why do you escape from your home city? So you escaped from that other city because the Nazis breaking. You see the Nazis was breaking that. What does that mean? That you escaped?
You mean how did we escape from another city? Is that what you said? Pardon? From Prague? Well, we didn't. I mean, escape is perhaps the wrong word. We left.
Yeah,
we left, and it was all. By the way, one of the lucky things that we had is we never had to do anything illegal. Everything that we were lucky that we were able to get all the papers that the Nazis required, and so it was much easier. It wasn't quite as dramatic. Although I will say one thing, on the trip from Prague to the Dutch border, we had just settled in. You know how in those days the European trains all had compartments. And so at the next stop, about 20 minutes into the trip, the door opened and in came a fully clad, 6-foot, blonde, blue-eyed SS man and sat down next to me. And of course my mother was panicked because if I was sleeping and if I had fallen asleep and had kicked this guy by accident, that could well have been the end of us. I mean, you have to understand the uncertainty of life in these circumstances where you never know what's going to happen. It turned out that this was a friendly SS man who helped my mother take the luggage down from the rack and never asked whether she was Jewish. So miracles happen. Anyway, so this is question number 2.
Knowing your nanny was such an important part of your life, did she travel with you as well?
Did she what?
Traveled with you as well? Did she go with you all?
No, she certainly wouldn't. In fact, one of the things that I should mention, because these are things that are not often said. My father had many Gentile friends and colleagues, and some of them, he reported to me, said to him, you know, you're lucky, you could leave under very dire circumstances, but we can't leave. There's no way we would get an exit visa from the Gestapo for a Gentile German to leave. So my nanny did not leave with us, and we couldn't have afforded her anyway. But she was very good to my grandparents, and she was very good to some of the survivors who came back from the war, and who came back from the concentration camps after the war. And I'll tell you one other thing. I visited her after the war, and it was a very emotional reunion. And she had her tzores too. After the war, there was an outbreak of strep in Vienna. Penicillin existed, but Austrians couldn't get it. So she had her daughter die, even though it could have been prevented. She was certainly as good a Gentile as you could imagine. She was very good to us. Thank you.
For just a couple minutes, and then we welcome all of you to go to the reception that we have. Thank you.
It's my honor and pleasure to speak on behalf of my students and the staff at New Tech Academy. If you don't know anything about the school, we're housed inside of Wayne High School. And then I'm going to force the students to actually explain what we do and why we are so special. Can't believe I'm up here speaking on behalf of my students when they did it, and it was their pleasure to bring to life people that they did research on from the United States Holocaust Museum. The museum has 598 personal IDs. When I was at IPFW, I met a special professor named Dr. David Lindquist that pushed me to study something I already had a passion for, and it's been him as the backbone of me trying to get my students to do powerful work, and you'll be able to see some of that. I've been proud of them for the last month. They started a month ago with an art project that was brought about by Mrs. Schreier at the Jewish Federation, and she gave us an opportunity to make the project authentic, and I don't think the kids understood the power of what they were creating, but when they were finished, I remember a couple students looking back and had tears in their eyes going, I can't believe that people that survived and perished during the tragic events of the Nazi rise to power may see this. And it was nice to see that finally the kids were putting some kind of passion and emotion and empathy into something that a lot of times their first answer when we started the project in January was, what do you know about the Holocaust? And it was 6 million Jews died in Hitler, and that's about it. And I'm excited to say that in June when they leave my class, they will be the next generation of those that are going to educate people in the Fort Wayne area or wherever they move to about the events of the Holocaust and how that we can bring empathy to the Jewish culture and those other groups that were unfortunately attacked during Hitler's rise. So I'm just going to explain real quick. I can't keep things short, so when she said 2 minutes, usually, and if I'm speaking from the heart, it's going to go a long time. So I'll try to make this short and sweet and to the point. The students were given 24 topics provided by the United States Holocaust Museum, and they chose the topic. And they actually went out and tried to find a way to present that topic in a form of art. And a lot of them said, Roberts, I hate art, I'm not good at art. And when you walk through that row of tables and a row of art pieces, you'll be amazed of what these students can do. And we see it on a day-to-day basis. I'm just proud that you guys actually the community gets to see what they do on a day-to-day basis. The storyboards, the students, I say go through the personal IDs. Last year, they just picked the first 20 they got to. And I was a little embarrassed by it. This year, the students looked for a personal impact on themselves, whether it was a birthday or a name or they're a twin. And you'll see in the storyboards, they had to research various topics about the person and have it come to life. And hopefully we brought their stories to life, and hopefully we brought the art to life. And we're proud to say that we've represented those with a great amount of empathy. So students, if you would stand real quick. And it's not always about you, and it still won't be, but I hope that when you grow up and have your own kids, that you'll be able to tell a story, and they'll be able to tell a story so that we never forget, and we always remember. So thank you very much for having us. And
So again, we welcome you to come to the back. Please take the time to look at the art, look at the storyboards. The students will be there to explain anything you'd like. And of course, because this is a Jewish function, there is food. So please, and thank you for being here.